morning, church. It's Sunday the 27th of June and welcome to Dale Street Church Online. We're looking at the subject of why church, and we've had a 6-part series of all of the different elements of church and why it's so important for us to meet together. And so today is the 7th part of our 6-part series. Of course that doesn't add up, but actually we should have been back at church today. Following what was planned to be Freedom Day on Monday of last week. That would have released us into all things being back to normal, and we had planned to be back at church. So our 6-part devotional series on why church has suddenly turned into a 10-part devotional series on why church. And so this morning we're looking at another element of church, an important aspect of why we come together, and that's the subject of growing. And we're going to read some verses together in Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to read verses 14 to 16. And Paul writes there, "Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies, so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow, so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love." I don't know what your significant memories will be of the last 15 months since that original lockdown statement in March 2020. I don't know what things have changed for you and what you will do differently following these last months of lockdown. For us, one of the things that has changed is that when we were back in April of 2020, Jo mentioned that she would like a greenhouse. And so I ordered some timber and we had some glass cut. And over a period of about 4 weeks I built a greenhouse and we put it out in the back garden. We started growing things and it did okay. In all honesty, I thought it was just one of those fleeting issues, one of those things that would be a passing fancy. But indeed it has lasted. And now we've got, this year, it's exploded into life. So in the greenhouse we've got all sorts of things. We've got things that we've grown bedding plants from seed, or Jo has anyway, and we've also got things like tomatoes and beans and courgettes all growing in there. Indeed, it's got so big that she's had to expand, and we've created some raised beds to plant vegetables in, and now we've got a number of different vegetables. We've got radishes, we've got spring onions, we've got beans, and we've even got rhubarb, yes, rhubarb, and so much more. And it's interesting to watch Jo as she goes out and cares for these plants and helps them to grow and support them. The essence of achievement there is in seeing these things grow from seed as she repots and as they enlarge, and then we put them out in the garden and they develop. And just that sense of achievement, seeing them grow and become stronger and more fruitful. And of course it keeps her busy out in the garden and it allows me time to watch the Euros, so it's all good. In Ephesians, Paul writes to the church. He's concerned about the church, he's concerned about things coming in that will divide the church. And so he writes to the church about growing together in love. In fact, in the previous chapter, chapter 3, he writes these words about a prayer for them to grow. Verse 17 says, "Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong." It's interesting in the authorised version that Paul uses the phrase rooted and grounded. Two very different terms, but important for us to understand. And he says that's the way we should be connected to God's love, rooted and grounded. Well, rooted is an agricultural term. The dictionary definition is to establish deeply and firmly. It's interesting in this prayer that Paul actually prays more about the root than he does about the fruit. In Galatians chapter 5, another letter that Paul writes, he goes in detail about the fruits of the Spirit and how they develop and how they evidenced. But actually here Paul's more interested in the root of our faith, the root of our lives, rather than particularly the fruit. And he goes on in the following verse and says, oh, that you would just understand God's love and how high and how wide and how long and how deep that love is. Just that you'd understand it. The Bible tells us, as we read in Romans, that God demonstrated that love. He showed us that love at the cross when the Lord Jesus died for us just as we are, just as we were sinners. That love was made so clear and so apparent and made such an impact on those who were watching. We refer to that love often as agape love, and that's not just a love of emotion, but that's a love that drives action. And that's exactly what happened at the cross. God loved us not just in an emotional way, but he drove into action in giving his own son, and that was then God's love demonstrated at the cross. I was reading some little thoughts of some kids that had been interviewed, ages between 6 and 8, and the question was asked of them, why do people fall in love? How do people fall in love? May, age 8, answered, no one is sure how it happens, but I heard it had something to do with how you smell. That's why perfume and deodorant are so important. And Andrew, age 6, says, I think you're supposed to get shot with an arrow or something like that, but the rest of it isn't supposed to be as painful. Well, God's love wasn't an accident and it wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate, it was all-inclusive, and it was and is life-changing. Paul says, just if you could understand the height and the width and the length and the depth of God's love, it will transform your life. And if you're rooted in love, then the fruits of your life will indeed show love. That's what the Lord Jesus said, isn't it? By this will all men know that you are my disciples. And the NLT says, it's slightly different way, as you trusted him, your roots will grow down and will keep you strong. So rooted is an agricultural term. Grounded is an architectural term. The dictionary definition is to be based firmly upon. As you know, I have worked in windows from my teenage years, and we in our business, we manufacture windows and we sell them and we install them. And one of our projects in Watford, we have a project with blocks of apartments, and one of them is 23 stories high. I was interested to watch the amount of time, effort and money that was invested in the foundations of this 23-storey building. I could not believe the amount of concrete that was being pumped underground to support this vast, substantial building. Of course, the building is only as good as the foundations that it is placed upon. We've seen the really sad incident in Miami just over the last 48 hours as a result of foundations that weren't strong enough. And Paul in Corinthians writes to the church and he says, for no one can have any other foundation other than Jesus Christ who we have. So Paul's prayer here in these verses is that we build our lives, that our lives and our experience are all built on love and on the foundation we're grounded on Jesus Christ. That's why the Lord Jesus in this passage in Matthew chapter 7, what we often refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, that's why he talks in this parable about the wise builder and the foolish builder. He says, don't be like the foolish builder who builds his house on something that's moving, that's not firm. He says, but be a wise builder and build your house upon a firm foundation. And I don't know if you remember your last holiday. Holiday seems to be a thing that have been distant now for some time. The last holiday we had, we were blessed to be in the Caribbean, and our transfer from the airport to the hotel took us down a main road, and it was interesting to see along this main road that there were a number of houses that had been partially built. some that had only got just above ground level, some that had got the roof on, but many that had not been completed. Most of those houses, I guess, were built on a really good foundation, and there was nothing wrong with the foundation they were built on. But what had actually happened is that during the build programme, that the person who was building had either run out of money or run out of interest, or other things had taken over, circumstances had changed, the energy to build had deceased. Well, I guess the Christian pathway is littered with people's lives who were built on the right foundation, but during that building process they have run out of interest. There's a lack of energy. They started well, but they've been distracted. And the Lord Jesus doesn't want to dwell in a house that's partially built, or even a house that's been built and is crumbling, but he wants to dwell in a house that's built on firm foundations. So Paul encourages us in these verses to be rooted, to be really deeply embedded in God's love, and to be grounded on the firm foundation that is Jesus Christ, that we might grow and become strong. So why church? Well, that we need to grow. The Bible clearly tells us that. And in these verses that we read right at the start, there's 3 reasons Paul gives for us to need to grow. The first one, he says that we are no longer like children. One of the things I'm looking forward to when we eventually do get back to church in 4 weeks' time is to see the kids and to see how they've changed. I guess they've grown up, they've shot up. 15 months it's been since we've seen them. And so those that were toddlers are probably now young children, and those that were young children are now growing into teenage. I guess one of the most stark differences will be with someone like Isla, who was just tottering about when we saw her last. She was a little bit wobbly. Someone once said we start off wobbly and then at the end of our lives we get wobbly again, but that's another subject. And when we're young and we're little children, we are a little bit wobbly. I was thinking about those little toys, I don't know whether you remember them. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. They were little toys that were just weighted in the bottom, and they would fall over all over the place, but then would stand back up again. Paul says we don't want to be like little children, just wobbling about, blown around by every wind of doctrine. He says we want to mature, and we want to be able to stand firm. He goes into that, doesn't he, in chapter 6 of Ephesians, where he talks about having the ability to stand against the devil's actions and to put on the whole armour of God, that we might be mature and that we might be strong. Not only that, he says, but we also want to grow more and more like Christ. That we're not conformed to the way of this world, but our minds are transformed, and we seek to be more and more like Christ in our actions, in our words, in our character, and in our love. And finally, he says that as we grow, it helps other parts of the whole body grow, that we might grow together healthy and full of love. And so that's it. Why do we need to grow? That we're no longer like immature children, that we're more and more like Christ, and that it helps other parts of the church, of the body, grow with us, to be healthy and full of love. Let's be rooted and grounded in the love of God.